All right, welcome back, y'all. It's 10:30, and we're going to have a few things to talk about right here with our NFL Eagles insider, John McMullen. Follow John at JF McMullen on Twitter. So, John, your thoughts. I'm going to waste no time here. Your thoughts on everything that went down last night. There's so many different ways to look at it, a lot to get into, but people really were not happy.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised, honestly. It was so much going on with this team, starting with the quarterback, whether you want to call him the starter or not, Carson Wentz. And everybody's just going nuts over this tanking, which, look, you know me, Ryan. I'm not a fan of tanking, but there's a difference between, years of tanking and not trying to win a meaningless game. I don't advocate either, but, one is much worse than the other. And it's not the first time it's happened in the NFL, but for some reason, I don't know if it was because it was flexed and it was the national game on Sunday night. I mean, people are losing their minds. It's astonishing to me. And when did Nate Sudfeld become a Make-A-Wish kid? He's been in this league for a lot of years. In this week, there were XFL quarterbacks, a CFL quarterback, an AAF quarterback playing in meaningful games. I don't get it.
You're lost for words. All right. Here's my honest assessment of it. It's the reaction is ridiculous, and that's standard for typically any story nowadays, where there's more than one opinion, which is everything. But you look at the timing of it. It's the start of the fourth quarter. Jalen Hurts played the whole game. It's on national TV. You hear the no hats on the field. You want to win the game against your rival. You want to try and assess Jalen Hurts more. That's a perfect way to do it. Last game, fourth quarter, nationally televised against a rival, down 3. Now's when you put in Nate Sudfeld. Like there's things I can get behind where I say, I don't like it. But the whole Giants thing, dude, you're 6-10. So what are you blaming the Eagles for? Joe Judge calling out Doug Peterson and the Eagles for their effort.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
I know. Tough guy Joe Judge calling out Doug Peterson and the Eagles. Philly people have to be torn because, Joe's a Philly guy. He's Lansdale Catholic, so on top of that. But, yeah, I mean, it's silly. They are 6-10. I said if you're 6-10 in this league, you can't complain about anything.
Right.
I mean, and it's interesting. It only seems to work in one way, tanking to get a better draft pick versus, good teams tank all the time at the end of seasons. Nobody seems to care about that. I mean, they rest players for the playoffs. Some do, some don't. And we've seen, Andy Reid has done it. He's not done it. We've seen that. And it depends on the individual coach. And I've always said in this league, because there's such a small sample size of games, if there's only 16 games in a 32-team league, if you're in position to not have to play someone for success or for draft choice and non-success, do whatever the heck you want. And by the way, this is why the NFL changed the schedule a number of years ago and put division games at the end of the schedule, because this has been going on for years.
Right.
And they've done a good job trying to limit it as much as possible. And the theory was, well, if you're playing a division rival, you'll be more likely to want to at least compete.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't always work. And in this instance, and I do believe it was more Jeffrey Lurie and really Jeffrey Lurie, I'm not even going to throw Howie Roseman into that, driven. What are you going to do? They wanted the draft choice. And I don't think there's a big difference between 6 and 9. You draft well, you don't draft well, you pick the right player, you don't pick the right player. But, look, that's what these advanced analytics people believe in, and that's Jeffrey Lurie. That's his gig, so to speak.
Yeah, and I want to ask you I want to ask you a couple more things here in a second. I brought up the fact of you blame the league, too, if anyone. I mentioned this to Luke earlier, who's sitting with me, John, and I said, dude, like the league flexed Philly and Washington into this game because they're two big markets and they felt like it would help their viewership. So if you really want to blame anyone, they decided to put a team into the spotlight that had nothing to play for and more to gain if they lost than if they won. So the NFL, if you really want to point a finger, I would say they're the one you pointed at, and I'm not even saying they're deserving of it, but that's just another way to, I think, view it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not going to kill them for that, only because the reason they flexed that game is it was because it was the only game that wasn't contingent on other games. In other words, for instance, I think typically Green Bay, Chicago would have been the game to move because Green Bay was fighting for the number one seed. Still, Chicago was fighting for the last playoff spot. However, if things went in a different direction in other games, Chicago could have been, in theory, out of it, even though both teams ended up making the playoffs. They could have been, in theory, out of it by the time of kickoff. So this was the one game that you knew no matter what happened was going to be meaningful. That's why the league shifted that game.
Makes sense.
And as I said, from a larger standpoint, they've done as much as they can to make these games important, and it generally comes down to individual organizations. And that's what we talked about with Jason Kelsey, who was pretty passionate a couple weeks ago, saying, you never not play to win the game. But, Jason Kelsey's not in charge. Jeffrey Lurie's in charge. So it comes down to individual organizations. Eagles aren't the first team to do it. They're not going to be the last team to do it. And down the road, it might happen to them, and they'll be upset. No question about it.
Yeah, John, Luke Pergandy here. You make a good point. Like, if bad teams shouldn't do it, why is it acceptable for good teams to do it? That's an excellent counterpoint that, Andy Reid will do this, and, there's excellent teams that start sitting quarterbacks and receivers in week 17. That's throwing a game as well.
Well, they have, I think that's, just to play devil's advocate to both of you, it's more justifiable in that scenario. We're getting ready to win a Super Bowl where the Eagles aren't, and they can play spoiler on that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Not saying I agree with that.
Yeah, but that's the point. You have to add, and that's where I'll agree with Luke and say, you're adding context to fit a narrative.
True.
Yes, they have more to play for. They're going to play next week. And, whether you want to justify that or not, bottom line is they are affecting other teams
totally.
Almost universally in those type situations by not playing their best players. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
The fact that they're going to play the next week or in 2 weeks if they have a bye doesn't mean it's not affecting that potential other team, which is what we're talking about with the New York Giants. Same thing. So if it affects another team, you're not. What did Joe Judge say? You're not respecting the game.
Right.
I mean, it's just it's been going on for. And I'm sure, by the way, where Joe, the Patriots were in the playoffs for so long, so many years, they did it too.
Right. I mean, any team has that's been in that scenario, and the Patriots over the past 15, 20 years were in that, situation often. So I think, Luke's right. That is an excellent point that you bring up, and it's apples to apples, I would say.
Yeah, I'm also not understanding why this is so common in basketball. Like, Mark Cuban was so blatantly throwing games 3 or 4 years ago to eventually get Luka. And, Twitter didn't lose their minds when Mark Cuban's throwing basketball games for the Dallas Mavericks. Like, why the Eagles throw one game in, 8 years, and this is just, the biggest sin ever. But Mark Cuban throwing dozens of basketball games.
The Sixers.
The Sixers, sure.
Well, yeah, you don't have to go out of this town.
No.
Nobody knows more about tanking than Philadelphia. I mean, they did it for years.
Right.
And there's a large chunk of that fan base, and that's the ironic part because it's a lot of the same people. It's fine for the Sixers. It's not fine for the Eagles. Why? Because you like the Eagles better. You have emotion invested.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. You'd have to ask each individual person. But, from the standpoint, and Doug was in a difficult situation because he can't go up there after a game and say, yeah, we didn't care if we won or lost.
Yeah, no, then you get fined.
But he did bring up, and there are certain guys, and Jason Kelsey, Brandon Graham, Zach Ertz out there for the entire game. Those are big-time players. So it's a little bit of focus on one particular player. And Doug's claim was that, Nate's been here for 4 years. He worked so hard. He wanted to give him an opportunity to get in the game at least a little bit. I don't necessarily know if that's true, but he does have a point as far as Ertz playing to the bitter end, Kelsey playing to the bitter end, Graham, Darius Slay. Those guys were all out there.
Do you think, because that's a point that's somewhat legitimate, like, locker room and the players aren't going to be happy. Do you think the organization and or Doug told the guys before the game, listen, this is the plan, whether we're up by 20, down by 20, or a tie game, Nate's the quarterback for the fourth quarter, for the final 3 drives or whatever it is. And if he didn't do that, is this an impact for the locker room?
No, I asked Jalen Hurts after the game if it was the game plan, if he knew he was coming out, and he admitted he did. So they went in the game. He understood he was not finishing this game.
Okay. Before the game started.
I do think that I because of what was going on in the offensive line, the tackles were Matt Pryor, left tackle, and Jordan Mailata had the concussion, so he had the flip sides. And Brett Toth was the right tackle playing starting his first NFL game. And on the other side, you had Chase Young and Montez Sweat. I think the Eagles thought they were going to be blown out by halftime, and they'd go to Nate Sudfeld in the second half. And it ended up being closer, largely because of the defense, and they were trying to invoke that no-hat rule to let Jim Schwartz go out on a winning note, and they were really competing, making some plays, turnovers, and it turned out to be closer, and I think that put a bigger microscope on the decision. But, yeah, it was the plan. Nate was always going to play. And then, Jalen wasn't exactly good. I think he finished 7 of 20. He did run the football, obviously, well, and had 2 rushing touchdowns. But neither quarterback played well for that reason. They couldn't even breathe with those tackles out there trying to block those 2 ends.
Last question regarding the decision. Whose decision was it in your mind?
Yeah, as I said, I think it certainly smacks of a Jeffrey Lurie decision. That's just his belief. I mean, he's very analytically driven, and he's one of those people that's going to look at it and say, what good is a meaningless win going to do for us versus gaining 3 draft spots? They would have picked 9th if they won that game. They'll be picking 6th. And people like that don't, to be honest, and I've talked about this with you, Ryan, a lot in reference to basketball, people like that think it's in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And they don't take into account the human aspect of it and the fact that Kelsey and Graham and Slay and Ertz are busting their you-know-what out there to try to win a football game. They have a disconnect to that. I mean, Zach Ertz, I got to tell you guys, he's not going to be back here next year.
Mm-hmm.
He sat by himself on Lincoln Financial Field on the bench after the game for 15, 20 minutes, just looking at the stadium, taking it all in. And then later he came out with Carson Wentz and Jason Kelsey.
Mm-hmm.
They all just sat and talked till about 1:15 in the morning. And they all might be not back for different reasons. But and then we talked to Zach, and, this is called clean-out day typically. It's first time on Zoom. It's all different. But nonetheless, he cried at the end of his Zoom because, he doesn't think he's going to be back. That's how emotional this game is for some of these guys. And the people caught up in the analytics part of it, they don't get that.
They don't care.
They don't have that connection to it.
Right. Yeah, and we'll get into that here in a few minutes, but I want your thoughts on Jim Schwartz and the Jim Schwartz era in Philadelphia. 5-year run in Philadelphia is over. You wrote about this on SI.com, so be sure to check out the article in John's written word. But, John, why don't you get into detail from some of that now?
Yeah, Jim's contract is expiring, so how they're framing it is he has decided to leave on his own, and we'll try to get that locked down in the next couple of weeks. I think it's a little bit of, maybe he saw the writing on the wall, and a little bit of maybe he doesn't want to be involved with what's going on here. So I think in a lot of ways it might be 50-50. But I do think, Jim has talked about taking a year off and contemplating retirement. He did have some health issues. He had, if you remember, he had that eye problem a couple of years ago. Had eye surgery, had hip surgery. So he has had some health problems. And he says he's going to step away. Ultimately, I think he's going to be back. He's going to be a coordinator in this league because he's one of the best coordinators. Look, I've said it from the start. There was going to be a scapegoat, and it wasn't going to be Howie Roseman. It wasn't going to be Doug Peterson. So, him or Dave Phipp, and this fan base wanted their pound of flesh. And I don't think Dave Phipp would have gave him that pound of flesh. So I think Jim was the most likely to go.
I'm just going to throw names out there for a replacement. Wade Phillips comes to mind. I've heard his name for the Raiders, too. Gruden's allegedly going to clean a lot of house and bring in some guys that can bolster that staff. So I imagine something similar is going to go on in Philadelphia, although we've seen it almost every offseason. But at least the defensive coordinator spot, who's going to be next?
Yeah, well, I think if you listen to Doug, Doug spoke very highly of Jim and did want to confirm that he was leaving. Brandon Graham actually finally did today. He was the first one to admit it. But, if it's true and Jim is walking away on his own accord, I do think you're simply going to see an elevation of Matt Burke to be defensive coordinator. If it was more than that and they were looking to go in a different direction, you're going to see that outside name. And Jeffrey's big on that, outside voices. I just tweeted out, this is snake oil season. Owners think they know X's and O's, and they get caught up in this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think the way the Eagles do business, it would be somebody like Wade Phillips, who I don't know exactly how old Wade is, but he's got to be 74, somewhere in that range, over 70. I would think they, just by their nature, they would want to have sort of the young gun, up-and-coming flavor of the month type.
Right. So
fans will get caught up in the names they know. The first name, Dan Quinn, fans would hate Dan Quinn. They hated Jim Schwartz. That guy just plays cover three. You saw how many leads Atlanta has blown over the years. But it's a name everybody knows. Ultimately, as I said, if Jim, because he had such success here, if he's truly walking away on his own accord, I think they're going to just promote Matt Burke.
So what have we learned this week, John? I should say last week in Week 17 leading up to the game, because we last spoke on Wednesday. So a lot has happened. Have you learned anything new or adjusted any opinions as far as Carson Wentz? Another report came out. Howie Roseman has spoke. So there has been a lot more information that has been put out there for us. So what's your overall outlook, if at all different, for the Eagles offseason?
It's not necessarily different from the Eagles' perspective because there's so many hurdles, but they do have to repair the relationship. It's now abundantly clear that Carson Wentz wants out of here, doesn't want to be back. Chris Mortensen was the one who reported he is going to ask for a trade. And he can ask, but that doesn't make it easier to do. He is willing to do everything he can to help the salary cap issues from the Eagles standpoint. But again, that's not the biggest hurdle. The salary cap part of it is not the biggest hurdle. The dead money part of it is the biggest hurdle, and that is simply a Jeffrey Lurie decision. Can we write off $34 million? Because that's what you're writing off. And some have said, well, yes, but if you keep him, you would essentially, because of the way the contract is structured, be guaranteeing him multiple millions, about another $25 million on top of that. So that comes down to, do they think he can play, or do they think he's a legitimate reclamation project? Then that's not that big of a number for a starting quarterback in this league, a veteran starter. If they don't think he can play, it's an awful number. So a lot of it comes down to how the Eagles actually view him and actually view if this is a worthy reclamation project, so to speak. And I find it very hard to, especially the way Jalen has played after his first game. He was very good in his first game, and he's gotten, let's be honest, he's gotten steadily worse from there. I don't think you could look at these 4 games and say, oh, that's a starting quarterback in the NFL. You can say that he's got the potential to be, but you're going to count on him for 16 games next year? 7 out of 20, 52% in 4 games? I mean, Carson was at a career low, I think it was 57.9, and that's awful. And Jalen was at 52. So, they got some issues, and they got to make some decisions at the quarterback position. And then once they make that decision, they got to repair the relationship with Carson Wentz because he doesn't want to be here. So there's a lot of moving parts.
John, so to explain this to someone who doesn't understand NFL contracts as well as you do, so you said the Eagles would have to write off $34 million. Let's just say, for example, the Colts want Carson to come play for them next year. Can the Colts, split that? So can the Colts say, we'll pay $17 million, Eagles put in $17 million, and then they strike a brand new contract for Carson? How is there a way that Carson's next team could help the Eagles pay that 34?
No, the difference is the salary cap versus the dead money, and the salary cap portion of it. I think that's where the average fan gets confused. That's very malleable. You can do a lot of different things. You can cook the books, so to speak, and that's what Howie Roseman is good at. And you can manipulate things to push it to other seasons, and all of that is easy. And I do believe Carson Wentz would be very desirous to help in that aspect to get out of town. So that isn't the problem. The problem is the Eagles have already spent that money. That money's gone, the $34 million. That's already gone. what we're talking about is the budgeting. So when you sign Carson Wentz to an extension in essentially 18 months ago, you not only agreed to pay him the $128 million, all the guarantees, which are an NFL record. As we said, you pay the youth signing bonus out. What you also do is budget that. You don't just forget about it. And when they signed that contract, there was no pandemic. The assumption was this is the NFL. This is the one league where revenues don't go down. They only go up. And that's typically true. The TV money keeps going up. It's going to continue to go up when they sign the new contract. However, no fans in the stadium this entire season for the vast majority of the league. Obviously, there are certain places that allow a small number. Dallas would be the biggest. So all you have to do is go to Forbes and, look at their revenue projection. Team like the Cowboys lost $500 million of revenue because of the pandemic. Eagles are in the $250 range. So you're not only asking Jeffrey Lurie to say, okay, write off this $34 million and say it's a sunk cost. You're doing it in a year where he's gotten $250 million less than he thought he was going to get when he signed the contract with Carson Wentz.
Mm-hmm. And the record for dead money in the NFL is $21 million. This would be 34. This would explode that record. Yeah, he doesn't want to be.
As I've explained it to Ryan numerous times, Jeffrey Lurie, you can say he's a billionaire. Certainly he could afford it. He's never struck me as being a Jerry Jones type who says, all right, forget about it.
Yeah.
George Steinbrenner type who says, do whatever you got to do. He's not that type of guy. He's never been that type of guy.
Good stuff from Johnny Mack, our NFL Eagles insider. John McMullen. Much more to get through the rest of the week every night at 10:30 on The Fix. We're up against it, John, but we appreciate it, and we'll dive into everything else tomorrow. All right, getting to the top of the hour. Much more still ahead with Luke when we start off at 11.
You're hearing AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio. Listen online at 1490sportsbettingradio.com.